Twitch lag to do its thing because Twitch likes to do that. Okay. There. Okay. Good. We are officially live now. Hello, everybody. Hopefully I had a bit of a connectivity issue before we started. Welcome. We'll wait for people to arrive. I'm here with Alex Macris again. You guys loved him last time. He's doing another crowdfund. I'll get that out of the way right away again while we wait people for the Twitch ads to go through and everybody to be here. So we've got buy this axe, the Cyclopedia of Dwarven Civilization. You see, it's well funded. The Canadian dollars make it look even more impressive, but you can check out the campaign. I will post the link. I should do that right now in the description box of the chat so that you guys can go find it, because that's the whole purpose of this exercise. Right now, there we go. It's in chat. And for people who come late, for people who this will be ported over to YouTube because there's no game music to wreck our fun in interviews like this, which is why they're kind of doing. So, okay, people are coming. Alex, hello. How are you?
Hey, hello. I'm good. How are you?
Okay, so did I basically summarize the idea of Buy This Axe? What is it? I'll let you do the pitch because obviously you know it better than I do. What's the book?
Buy This Axe. It's the Cyclopedia of Dwarven Civilization. It is a source book for old school D20 based fantasy RPGs that describes everything you could ever want to know and things you didn't want to know about dwarves as a people in every aspect of their lives: culture, biology, physiology, psychology, etc.
Yeah, no, guys, I'm apparently having trouble with my camera. I'll let you know now. It's my connection, but you can hear me fine. So we'll keep going. So we're talking world building and specifically the focus on race, right? And this has been a thorny issue since last year, but you've decided to tackle a specific what races of man, as Tolkien put it, but it's actually more species of humanoid. And that when you go deep dive into world building the way you have in this book, that matters, doesn't it? Because you have races within the species, correct?
Correct. So yeah, we should get that out of the way. You know, race is a word which has a lot of different meanings that have evolved over time. In the context of modern biology, dwarves, as I handle them, would be considered a separate species. They have their own different sex ratios, their own different lifespan, their own different physiology, their own different biology. And it's those differences from the human norm that make dwarves and not just fat men with beards. So I took the approach very similar to how one might make if you were writing like the complete Cyclopedia of Wookiee Civilization, right? Like you don't think of Wookiees as humans in fursuits.
Right.
They're Wookiees. They're something different. So dwarves are handled with a similar approach.
Yeah, and that basically is what a dwarf is: an elf, an orc, halfling. They're not humans. They're
Correct.
different. I mean, and this is where we get into sort of Tolkien smoked a lot of pot and said some contradictory things about his own work, where he swore up and down it wasn't allegory. He doesn't like allegory, but he compared the dwarves to Jews and the orcs to Mongols. And for some odd reason, the comparing dwarves to Jews got lost, but the comparing orcs to Mongols caused a bunch of rending of garments, to use a Turatic phrase, of late. The idea that we can't use these fantasy races to tell stories because there's one line in a letter that Tolkien sent to someone that refers to them as looking like basically the worst European stereotype of an Asian person. Now, where do you stand on that? And when you approached this source book, did you worry about that? Do you like, I'm just going to throw this out and not think about it, trust your feelings, blow up the Death Star?
Yeah, well, let's break it down to a couple of different issues. So I think Tolkien, we need to remember, was a philologist with an incredible knowledge of the classical literature. And in the classical literature, when you read about the Huns, the way they are described by the writers of the day is very much how he described orcs. So it's clear that he was not thinking of a particular modern day race. He was thinking philologically of how the people that he modeled his own civilizations after thought about this great enemy that was coming at them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In terms of how I've personally handled orcs, in my own game world in Axe, orcs are a corrupt species created by chaotic magic. And they are irredeemably evil. There are no good orcs. It is not possible to be a good orc. And I compare them to the xenomorphs from Aliens. Now, if you think about, very often people will have these silly alignment arguments. Well, they'll say, well, is it okay to kill orc babies? I think we should save the orc babies and we should raise them. And so I want you to just imagine the movie Aliens when Ripley and Burke confront each other. And Ripley says, we need to take off and nuke the whole site from orbit. And Burke says, no, this is an intelligent species. We need to work with it. We should try and talk to them. And it is very clear in that movie, Burke is the villain. He is wrong. The xenomorphs are an evil species, and the right thing to do is to take off and nuke the site from orbit. And that is the approach I take in Axe with regard to orcs. The correct approach is to fireball the village.
Right.
So orc babies are not cute little whelps that you will raise and turn into good citizens. Orc babies are starving, horrible monsters that gnaw off the breasts of their own mothers and cannibalize the weak ones, and the sooner you can kill them, the better. And so I think we've done ourselves a huge disservice by trying to say, oh no, orcs are people too, because when you're playing a fantasy game of heroes, you don't want to kill people. You want to kill monsters. Right? The ancient Greeks, the heroes kill monsters. They don't kill people.
Right.
Giants, trolls, ogres. So let's not make them people. Let's let them stay what they are. They're monsters. They're from our primordial fears and terrors of the dark. And that's what I've done. And once you make that cognitive adjustment, then all these sort of pseudo problems go away.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like about what you've done in the source book is you've done the sort of Volo narrator. So, it's sort of fictionalized anthropology, crypto anthropology, I guess you could say. And so if somebody wants to use this book and they don't like one thing you've done, it's like, well, they were just wrong about this research. So what core rules, you can change anything you want. And you've actually put a little note in there that the dwarfs were kind of fucking with the guy who wrote this book,
Absolutely.
right? I loved that detail.
The whole thing is written from the point of view of a fictional sage called Circanius of Cipheron, who has invented dwarology, which is the study of dwarves, and he's the first human being to ever live amongst the dwarves and write about them. And so I kind of imagined him as a cross between like a figure like Herodotus, or Pliny the Elder with his Natural Encyclopedia, where they present very straight-faced things that are absolutely absurd and can't possibly be right, but they just sort of present that. And then with a mix of like Victorian anthropologist who's really confident that his civilization is the best civilization, but he also thinks of himself as this really open-minded, broad person who's going to, be really respectful. And so I hope when people read it, they find it amusing, because I certainly had a lot of fun writing him. And there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in there for those who, kind of read between the lines.
Yeah, I like when people do character voices with source books like this, because like I said, you can throw at anything you want because it's in voice, right? It's sort of it's self-aware. It affirms the benefits of tabletop role-playing as opposed to in terms of the immersive experience of video games. It's a different immersion in tabletop role-playing that you can adapt it. It is sort of silly, right? You're aware everybody's playing a character, and people can play characters of different genders, and they put on voices, and we put on funny hats, and you're not going to spend 3 hours in makeup. Well, I might spend 3 hours in makeup to do a D&D campaign, but I am crazy. Most people don't do that. They're just, okay, here's a hat. I'm this now, right? And that's part of the joy of it, the inherent awareness that you're being silly. And that's why when I see these hot takes in things like Wired, it's like, have you ever played one of these games? Do you realize you're taking something as inherently serious and literal that is the exact opposite of serious and literal? Am I being judgy there? Am I missing something?
No, I think what you're describing, the term I've heard game designers use is the ironic distance between the player and the character, where, for instance, if you were actually on an adventure and your friend Bob had his legs gnawed off by a giant centipede, and then as he tried to crawl away, a boulder fell on top of him, that would be horrific. You would have PTSD. But in a game, if on round 1, Bob gets his legs gnawed off, and then on round 2, in his attempt to escape, he accidentally sets off the trap, and then his character gets killed because of a boulder, everyone at the table will be laughing because that's hilarious in the game. And it's that ironic distance is part of what makes it so pleasurable, is at the same time it's meaningful and risk and danger, and yet at the same time, it's not you. It's kept at a safe. It's also what makes horror very hard to do in most tabletop role-playing games, and games have to work really hard to be able to make you afraid.
That's what I think what Ravenloft did structurally that I found so interesting, and I'm glad that there's been sort of this renaissance of deep dives, because I mean, Ravenloft, it wasn't just a setting. It was, but part of it was, you could go to the fortune teller, and it was almost a collaborative thing where certain parts of the game weren't designed, they were dealt. And you go, you can scramble where Stroud is found, you can, so on and so forth. And so the DM sweating along with the party. And I think that's what made it work as a horror setting. But Ravenloft is also a setting that is inherently racist. The first time I played Ravenloft, I was warned, this is a racist campaign setting. If you play as a dwarf, because I liked playing as dwarves, you're going to have a really hard time. We recommend the first time you play as human. Nowadays, you might not be able to do that because of this sensitivity, and the fear of outsiders was a big part of Ravenloft, a big part of the horror, everything being tightly controlled, I think is a valid choice when you get into these campaigns. So what's your counter argument to this stuff that people are putting out in these articles about, no, D&D must apologize to people of other races and we all have to be good people, think of the children, so on and so forth?
I don't think artists have any obligation whatsoever to apologize to anyone for anything they do.
Right.
But I don't know that I can more bluntly state it than that. And if someone doesn't like a particular setting because of the artistic choices, I think it's absolutely their right to say, this setting is not for me and I don't want to play it. But I don't think that in any way it's condemnable to the person who created it. I think there's a lot of value can be found in playing in settings that are not like our own. It can help us understand how the world was for our ancestors who lived through such things. It can help us understand how the world is for people in other countries today. I think there's also tons of value in playing in fantasy made-up lands that are really fun and happy and don't have dire things and grim darkness. I think that's great too. It's an aesthetic choice. It's like, do I want to have a Jeep or do I want to have a Civic? Do I want to have a Corvette? It's an aesthetic choice. It depends on me personally. So, sorry, I'm not usually so vigorous in my open defense of a particular point, but that's something I feel strongly about.
At least not in public. I've seen you in private. Don't answer this question if you don't want to. Interesting segue there. But how do you feel about D&D either responding to the concerns / caving on this issue that they've said we do have to sort of rewrite this and rethink this, so on and so forth? Like I said, don't answer if you don't want to, but do you have any thoughts on the business decision inherent in they're an outcry and addressing the outcry?
They seem to be doing very well business-wise. So I would assume that they looked at the data, they looked at who was playing the game, they looked at the attitudes of those folks, and they decided, to cater to the sensitivities and attitudes of that group. And that's fine. That's their business choice. Sometimes there's value in catering to particular subcultures or cultural groups' attitudes, and you can really benefit from that. I think there's probably an under-tapped audience of folks that prefers more traditional themed games and attitudes, and certainly that's the space I play in. But I would consider myself very fortunate if I ever got 10% of Wizards sales for D&D. So no harsh judgment from me on their business practices.
Yeah.
They clearly know what they're doing.
So let's deep dive into world building, because that's a huge part of the source book. I mean, it's all world building, right? Like that's the whole point.
Yeah.
So, false binary question. Feel free to challenge me on this. Okay. But are fantasy races evil because of what they are in terms of orcs or the drow? Or are they evil because of what they do?
Right. It depends on the setting, I think.
Right.
In my own setting, there's an existential cosmic struggle between law and chaos, and the humanoid monstrous races, the orcs, the gnolls, etc., were created using chaotic magic to serve the chaotic gods, and they are innately chaotic. There's nothing redeeming about them, and they simply are incapable of doing good. If you imagine the scorpion and the frog story, when the frog is carrying the scorpion across the river, and then the scorpion stings him halfway across, and the frog says, "Why did you sting me? Now we're both going to die." And the scorpion says, "Well, it's just my nature." That's orcs. That's just their nature. So outside of the species or races that I've had created by evil magic, the others are they have, they're free-willed, and they choose their destiny. So there's good elves and evil elves, and good dwarves and evil dwarves, and good humans and evil humans. Now, I do tend to assume that a nation's morality on average lines up with its god's moralities. So, for instance, if you worship a god who demands constant human sacrifice and thrives on pain, then your society is going to end up being a more evil society, and the average person will see things that we would consider evil, and they would consider them normal. But I think there's a lot of different ways you can handle it, but that's personally the route I've done. And I do that because I enjoy the Tolkien-esque, Howardian, classic sword and sorcery and epic fantasy. And I don't get a lot of pleasure out of seeing my players sit around and argue about whether or not they need to, kill the kobold babies or things like that. I don't find that fun. I don't find that interesting. Yeah. That's not the sort of story I think I like to explore with my role-playing games.
I don't know if you guys noticed, the minute we started talking about chaos, my cat Zelda left. She jumped down in the background. She's like, "What? Chaos is evil. I'm gone." She was sitting on my notes before then, so I got them back.
Cats are definitely chaotic. Dogs are lawful. This is
now, Oron says chaotic equals evil in this setting, no chaotic good.
Okay, so that's a great question. I'll have to wax philosophical here for a moment. So if you go back to the ancient world, and my game Axe is set in in antiquity, not in the Middle Ages. If you go back to the ancient world, the primordial struggle is law versus chaos. And law, which was called Arta, Mat, Athos, Logos, bunch of terms, all these cultures used it. So law includes order, truth, beauty, goodness, everything that makes the cosmos continue in its proper and fitting way. And chaos is disorder, entropy, darkness, and it's represented by Typhon and Set and Tiamat. And the act of creation is the act of taming chaos in order for law, logos to thrive. So I specifically chose that because it's an ancient way of the view of the world, and it's not our contemporary view of the world. So modern ethics is very different than that of our ancestors. And so a modern person who reads the Iliad thinks really differently about Achilles' deeds than a Greek would have. And I wanted to put people in the framework of thinking themselves the way the ancients did, and not how we moderns do. Because I think it can really limit you if you try and play in antiquity like you're a dude from Cleveland.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what's so fun about the God Pantheon in something like Dungeons and Dragons, right? Because you play a priestess of Umberlee, your idea of good and evil are not the norm.
Exactly.
Like you said, even something like Torm or Helm versus Lathander.
Yep.
You do, and you can play as sort of a rebel, sort of a chaotic follower of one of these these deity structures, these religions, for lack of a better term, but it does matter. And I've had fights in D&D groups, at D&D Drama we talk about on the It's Not Therapy show this Thursday, where I had a much more nuanced view of morality than the person running the game. I had real trouble with the PC game Neverwinter Nights because of this. Because I couldn't follow lawful and I kept losing my paladin skills. Meanwhile, the big bad in the game was a fallen paladin, so I was going WTF every time I hit neutral, neutral good. But it was because of the build I was playing, and the game wasn't clear whether you were supposed to follow man's laws or your god's laws. And I was like, I'm a paladin. If it's a choice, it's God's law over man's law.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So you're on the same page that way, because you mentioned the moral frameworks. Now, this gets into the purpose of an evil race like the Drow. And I focus on the Drow because it's sort of this, they're a matriarchal race. There aren't many matriarchal races. The elves are, but they cover it up better. Right? The high elves. The high elves, the sun elves, the wood elves, whatever you want to call it. This is where it's species and race. They're different things, right?
Yes.
And so
elf is the species, and then Drow is a race. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, as somebody, we fight about definitions in our world. Right? There's all this fights over what is a man, what is a woman, what is this, what is that. Playing Dungeons and Dragons to me is part of what informed me of how these words really, and believing we know what these words mean, can really mess with us, right? Because this whole fight is the interpretation of race as opposed to species. And when you get the splits within the elves, Drow society is very different than surface elf society. And part of it is because they live in the Underdark, and it's a very unforgiving place, which requires certain things. But then there are other things that are just like, they are misandrists who believe that men are inferior, and they are open about practicing slavery. And I think it's fair to say a race like that does things we recognize are bad, to say that's evil. Orcs that are conquest, they're marauders. It's not about the way they look, it's their behavior that makes them evil. And you can get into the theology of inherent evil, but I struggle with this of being too complacent in the our world debate about, we shouldn't, racism is bad, therefore we shouldn't allow bad things in role-playing games. But isn't the whole point, this is a bit of a leading question, but I'm sure you'll take it. Isn't the whole point of playing evil in a fantasy game ultimately to affirm your concept of good? Because you're knowingly playing as an evil character, right?
Yeah. So I would say there's probably two different reasons why people play evil characters. One is to, as you say, affirm what it means to be good by experiencing what life is like on the other side. I think the other is for a certain category of person who might feel frustrated with the constraints of the world, and they might want to sublimate that anger into a role-playing game where they can misbehave towards NPCs who no one is really getting hurt. I've certainly had a few friends that use role-playing games like that, particularly in high school when we always had, you always had your angry heavy metal friend who hated the world.
But enough about Stranger Things.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. Beyond that, I think part of the problem is that our society today is a philosophical catastrophe. And the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre talks about this in his book, After Virtue. And he basically shows that the entire edifice of contemporary ethics has been demolished. It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and none of it makes sense. And he says you only have two options. You can either go back to the ancients and you can see what Aristotle said, or you can just accept what Nietzsche says and might makes right, and that's all there is to it. And It's a very, very powerful book. And so then he says we should go back and rediscover what morality was by looking at the ancients. And what the ancients expressed was that that morality is the art of how you live in a flourishing way, how you flourish as a creature of your type. And so Aristotle then very specifically sort of thought through, as a human being, what do you need to do to flourish? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a philosopher named Philippa Foot who sort of updated Aristotle, and she wrote a book called Natural Goodness. And in it, she uses wolves as her example of morality. And she says, imagine a wolf who refuses to hang out with other wolves. He won't pack hunt. He doesn't contribute to the hunts. After everybody else does all the work, he shows up and tries to still eat. He doesn't help protect the puppies. He doesn't bark when there's intruders. And she says, this is a bad wolf. This wolf is not going to flourish as a wolf. He might do well if he were a jaguar, but he will not flourish as a wolf. Mm-hmm. And her point then is that, we can appraise goodness for humans in a similar manner by looking at what makes for flourishing humans and flourishing human civilizations. But in the context of a fantasy game, what you then take from that is that what a good orc is probably monstrously evil to us, but the other orcs really look up to him and admire him as an awesome orc, which is not to be relativistic because you're embedded in a world where these creatures serve various gods who are existential representations of good and evil and law and chaos. But it does mean that orcs probably don't sit around worrying about being evil and argue about the trolley problem. They just don't do that.
Right.
They behave in orc-like ways, and they excel at being orcs.
That kind of brings in an inherent kind of, maybe not a paradox, but a challenge when you're doing tabletop role-playing games in the D&D setting. I mean, White Wolf and other systems try to get around this by having, these are the qualities that make you stronger as a vampire, werewolf, or mage. Here are the qualities that make you weaker. They have to balance out in your character creation. But these old school games, these sort of D20 role-playing games, they do have sort of its morality is gamified. So the lawful, chaotic, good, evil, these are game rules. And then you've got the species, like you said, attributes, being an elf with a ton of fortitude probably won't do you as much good, as an elf with, you want that super high dexterity score.
Right.
Just as an example. Right. And it's that gamification of evil that I think teaches philosophy really well, because it's that thing you said, a good wolf is good at being a wolf, not good at being a jaguar. Right. But then you've got characters like Dritz Duerden, who is considered a good character, but he's a bad drow.
Right.
That sense of individuality, because I believe he's chaotic good. He's chaotic good. And so it's that the drow are basically a lawful evil society. He's chaotic good, so he's a bad drow but a good character.
Right.
And I think, is this something that you think most players eventually cotton on to because they've played so often and like, wait a minute, they stop and think about this? Or is the role of a source book like By This Axe to sort of draw that out and get people to think more about, this is not our world, this is a fantasy world that has meaning?
Yeah, so that's another great question. I think if you want to understand the alignment system in D&D, you have to understand that it's written from the point of view of lawful good. All of the alignment names are from the point of view of lawful good, so everything is judged by its deviance from that.
Okay.
If I were going to run a drow society, I would use the 9, the 3-factor alignment system. But what I would do is I would rename the axis. Instead of lawful and chaotic, let's say we want the drow to be lawful evil, I would have the axis be honorable and dishonorable. Right. And instead of good and evil, it would be weak and strong. And so drow aspire to be honorable and strong, and they despise Drizzt because he is dishonorable and weak.
Yeah.
And I actually ran a campaign once to test this theory, and I told all the players they were upholding law, and then they all were given leather cloaks, and they were called the Emperor's Talons, and they were given bronze badges, and they were given the ability to hunt down those who worshipped false gods, and burn the books, execute the witches, the whole schlemiel. And I just labeled them as lawful good for doing this. And they just proceeded to do just absolutely monstrous deeds in this campaign. And at one point, one of them was like, Alex, I really thought there'd be more sophisticated morality in this campaign, but it's really just black and white. And at that point, I stopped the campaign and I told them, I was like, guys, it actually is really gray. You're just all acting like sheep and doing exactly what your bosses always tell you, no matter how horrible and reprehensible it is, because I gave you a shiny badge and a black leather. I'm like, I don't know what else I could have done. Like, it's literally your outfits. Look at the picture, guys. Do they not resemble anything you've seen from World War II? And talk about
that's a life lesson.
It was a life lesson. So, I mean, I think you certainly, that if you want to run Drow, that's how you just have to do it. You have to rebrand the alignment axis, and then it makes more sense to people.
Now, again, another question that shows I've thought far too much about Dungeons and Dragons, but I always struggled with the fact that the species, the races of man, they provided different stat modifiers, but gender was purely a cosmetic choice. And what's your take on that? Do you think that's just, again, because these are gamified statistics, and if people want to say, okay, in my game you get these plus or minus stats, a couple of add-on books in first edition tried that and it just didn't work. What do you think the functionality is of having these species, pluses and minuses, but making gender cosmetic?
That's a great question. I think the trend probably is in modern games as they're moving towards making everything cosmetic, which I think is unfortunate, but that's the direction they're going. There were some efforts, if you go all the way back to the 1974 to 1983 period, when there was a lot of ferment in games, and you had, back when it was called The Dragon, they had a fanzine for D&D that was getting published. A lot of folks try to come up with some rules to model differences in gender. The problem that they ran into is that no one could agree on what the differences should be.
Right.
If you're making up a fantasy race, like if I say orcs are stronger than men, no one is going to present an actual orc to say, well, look, Alex, you're actually wrong. My best friend doesn't work. And, but when you're doing like male and female, pretty much any suggestion you make of an attribute or characteristic, you're going to find the exception because humans are so diverse. And I think it just became easier to accept that we're not gonna worry about it, and we're gonna let everybody just be the gender cosmetically that they'd like to be. And I think even today a large percentage of players prefer to play their own gender no matter what. So
yeah, that's what I eventually determined as well, that there's so much, like the stat build out, when you get all those attributes, there's so much inherent individualism in that if you added, it would be one more modifier, and we couldn't explain THAC0 back in 89. So I think it probably just would have been one more thing. I mean, right?
Like if you look in real life, right? There are no men earning $10 million a year on OnlyFans, but there are many women doing so. Okay. And so if we were going to model that in a game, we would have to in some way say that women get some bonus on their
charisma score.
On the other hand, if my friend Bob really, really wants, if we're playing some weird role-playing game and he really, really wants his character Steve to be an amazing OnlyFans star, okay, it doesn't break anything. It's perfectly fine. So we don't really need it. We don't worry about it. And likewise, if you look at sporting data, it's fairly clear that at the elite levels, it's very hard for even the best women to compete against the best men. There's just physiological differences that are very difficult for them to overcome. But then we say, well, look, that's true, but Red Sonja is awesome, and I want to be a total badass like Red Sonja. And the game is better for that, so we let it be. I think if someone was committed, that they said, I really want to play a super historically accurate game, and we really want it to be real, I'd be like, totally fine. And then what would happen would be everybody would just play peasants and you'd all die at age 18. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, the real medievalism isn't fun. We want that romantic filter on medievalism, right? And that goes back to that thing you said about constraints of the world and sort of what these games are designed to do. And it's interesting to me that, unlike the current discourse, people in these fantasy realms seem to think, well, the whole joy of playing these different species slash races are to cast off the constraints of the world, right? If you want to be someone, the dwarves. I mean, the reason I always like dwarves is because, well, first of all, they just sort of cast off human beauty standards. I started going, a skinny little twig-like woman would not be considered an attractive dwarf. You want some, you want some heft there. Yeah, right. Yeah. And then there was the whole thing, do dwarf women have beards? All that stuff. Is that why we've never seen a female dwarf? Because we just didn't know it, so on and so forth. When we get into the world building that you've done in By This Axe, you went even deeper than that. You changed it's not, well, there is a form of family unit, but it is not 2 people, it's 3.
That's right. It's the traditional 3-parent home.
Right. Now, that was a resource thing, right?
Yeah. So one of the tropes is that you rarely see dwarven women. So why is that? And what I decided is that the reason, and another trope is that the dwarves are always like portrayed as like a dying race. There's not as many of them as there used to be. They're constantly struggling against the hordes of the goblins. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what would be a physiological explanation for why there aren't very many dwarven women and there's not very many dwarves as a whole? And I said, well, what if when dwarves give birth, they give birth in a ratio of 2 boys to every girl? And so then by the time you get adulthood, you have 2 men per woman. And then I said, what if the women can only give birth once every 10 to 15 years? Because dwarves are so big and they take so much nutrition from the mother to create this formidable body that it's exhausting. And so then you would have a situation where it would be very hard to keep your population up when you figure the vagaries of war, and where either they'd have to adopt a 3-parent home structure of 2 men and a woman, or the majority of men, or 50% of the men, would have no marital opportunities. And so I created like a whole section of different cultural solutions that the dwarves have come up to this with. Like one group has practices polygamy, where it's 2 men per woman, and that's your traditional 3-parent home. Then in another, it's only the oldest brother is allowed to marry, and youngest brothers have to join like warrior brotherhoods and priesthoods and craft guilds and live as bachelors. Then I created another culture where what happens is that the dwarven mothers and fathers kind of auction their daughters off to the highest bidder by quests or gold or whatnot. And then I have like the sort of contemporary dwarves that are most influenced by Aran culture. And in those, then the woman is allowed to marry the dwarf that she loves. And, and there's lots of dwarven poetry written by old men about how their women are throwing away huge dowries by marrying, poor, handsome dwarves. So, I had a lot of fun with it, but it creates fascinating social structures that you literally, you just don't see in another species like ours. Another thing I did for the dwarves.
Did you not know that these are all the historic reasons for one woman, many male polygamous structures?
No, there are such structures in our culture, but they only come about in very specific circumstances. Yeah, I mean,
when they don't want to split familial land, or the Old West when there just weren't enough women. So you did draw from that. That didn't just. I was like, if that came out just based on a thought experiment, that's fascinating.
No, I looked up a bunch of different social structures and I took notes on them. Yeah. The other big thing I decided about dwarven physiology was that, they live 2 to 3 times as long as humans,
right?
But they age. They're not like elves who are ageless. So at about age 75, a dwarf becomes old, and then he just stays old, but he lives. And so it means that dwarven society is a society basically of old men. And that's why it's so traditionalist. It's so hidebound. It's so crusty and grouchy and curmudgeonly, because that's what old men are like. And so when you think about dwarven society as being then dominated by men, dominated by old people, what do you get? And boom. And that leads to a society that's very similar to the actual tropes that we encounter. But then you also get some very amusing outcomes for how powerful that would make an old woman who's had a long time to influence, produce a number of children, etc.
Yeah. How long did you plan this before you sat down to write it? I mean, was this just sort of something you mucked around with and it's like, hey, let's make it a book? Or
Yeah. So what happened was I had written some rules for Roman mining, so ancient Roman mining, and I wanted like my players to be able to mine gold and stuff. And they were like, this is really cool, but you should have written it for dwarven mining. Like that's who really does mining in a fantasy world. And I was like, oh, that's a good point. And then I had written some rules for like different types of farming, like rice farming and grain farming. And they were like, oh, you should do mushroom farming for dwarves. And I was like, oh, that's a good point. And then every time I kept doing these little things, people were like, oh, you should do this for dwarves. So one day I went onto my Discord and I said, should I do a book about dwarves? And they were all like, yes. So there was such enthusiasm for it. I started working on it. It took me about 6 months.
Wow. Now you must have had a ton of play experience to do it that quickly with this level.
Yeah. Because the mining rules had already been written. A bunch of the classes had already been written. So it was a lot of compilation effort. The majority of the work was just doing the lore in the first chapter.
Now, when you're self-publishing, totally changing gears to technical questions, how do you keep continuity in mind? Did you have beta readers? Did you just keep copious notes as you went? How did you make sure you didn't contradict yourself in, near the end, something you said in the beginning?
I definitely do use beta readers. I have a couple guys that are, very active in the community, and they will spot the most minor continuity error, like a hawk seeing a mouse in an open pasture from a mile up. It's
nice.
So,
nice. Yeah, that's because I imagine when you're doing something this dense, it's really easy to forget some little detail you put it as, oh, wouldn't that be cool? Well, it's cool, but it's totally different.
I mean, like in the very first edition of Axe, so we're talking, this is now 2011, so 11 years ago. I accidentally, when we were laying out the book, we accidentally put sheep under housing rather than under livestock.
Oops.
And like 11 years later, they still mock me for that, asking, I'd like, my character would like to go sleep in his sheep now. If I bring my sheep with me, can I take a long rest in the dungeon by cuddling with it? Like, I mean, it's just nonstop.
Hey, tauntauns were housing as well as food.
Exactly. So that that level of emotional damage teaches you to really take good notes. You don't want to do that to yourself.
Yeah. Now, why game books instead of just writing novels?
Oh, I mean, I've worked on writing novels, and obviously I did my first graphic novel this year. I suppose it's because I grew up running games, and then from running games, it became natural to design games, and I was working in the video game industry, so I happened to do a lot of consulting products in video game design. So it was kind of a natural outgrowth of skill sets I had built up, as compared to, I hadn't had many invitations to, hey, Alex, please come read your story that you've written at our Friday night story reading session.
Okay.
But certainly there was a lot of people saying, hey, come run your game at our Friday night game. So I do expect eventually I'll publish some novels probably set in my game world.
No, so it was just sort of organic. It wasn't, I am going to make rules and they will be good rules.
It was very organic, and certainly I don't think anyone sets out to become a tabletop role-playing gamer with some sense of great fortune to be earned there.
Now I'm a big believer that games tell us a lot about our cultures. And, I'm going to go back to Stranger Things as my camera has frozen again, but hopefully you guys can still hear me okay. Stranger Things 4 is out. They had that, trope of the metalhead who runs a D&D campaign, and he's that kind of DM who likes to try to kill everybody. Hated those guys. But then, they show what he's like in real life, and it's the whole Eddie's arc, and I won't spoil anything, but that was very much a snapshot in time first with all the metal culture and the crossover with the imagery into Dungeons and Dragons. We look to culture now. I mean, tabletop gaming is so fragmented, but culture is also so fragmented. And I mean, the fact that we've just got this split between Wizards of the Coast D&D and then Pathfinder, which is open source, and then, you know, D&D going less and less and less special species, right? Elves are less special, dwarves are less special because they're making them more and more and more human. There seems to be this homogenization of imagination going on right now. We've talked about this before in other contexts, but I mean, you're clearly rebelling against that, or you're clearly trying to offer an alternative to that. But what do you think that says about what's going on right now? Because that combination of fragmentation, but also homogenization within the fragments.
Yeah. So my general attitude is that I think consolidation into monopoly in virtually every circumstance leads to evil.
Okay.
Whether that be in corporations or whether that be in vast globalist government programs. I think power checks power. And so my natural inclination, from my gut is always to oppose whatever I see as the current monopolistic tendency and to go in a different direction. So when we started The Escapist, what was driving the industry was written reviews. And it was all about, get game reviews, give high scores, get ad dollars. And so we went in a totally different direction, and we did new games journalism in long form video and long form editorial. Axe is 180 degrees the opposite direction of contemporary Dungeons and Dragons, where you're just an adventurer for 20 levels on a sort of scheduled story arc with milestones. Axe is a totally different game than that. My superhero game, everyone has been moving towards these very rules light, fluffy narrative superhero games where, you kind of fudge it all. And I made a very crunchy, rules driven physics simulation super game. For whatever that says about me, I'm certainly cognizant of this homogenization that we see everywhere, and I kind of oppose it on every front, for good or for ill.
Yeah, I just don't see the point in playing a game where it doesn't challenge you to do things differently. It just feels like and this is me completely being biased, but it just feels like an exercise in ego to play somebody exactly like yourself and just sort of it's power gaming to me. And I know everybody starts there, but that's cool to start there. But eventually, to me, the beauty of RPGs is to pull yourself away from that gradually, which makes me think that the alternative, if you don't have those sort of crunchy rules, as you put it, would just mean more and more and more, getting comfortable in the ego, which is not what we want and sort of maybe what's happening. I mean, that sort of is what Death the Author postmodernism hath wrought, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And we see that effect. Sorry, I discussed that effect in my book Arbiter of Worlds, where I talk about the difference between a theme park and a living world, and between a roller coaster and a journey. And I think when you first play role-playing games, there's this temptation that you want everything to always go your way, and there's a sense of this wish fulfillment. And but what happens is, when you begin to play the games more, you begin to realize that if the game master is fudging the dice, if the story is being manipulated so that you always win, then your win is meaningless.
Right.
It hasn't actually been a challenge. There never was any real risk. And the triumph of victory is not sweet because there was no real enemy. And it's only when you introduce the possibility of failure, it's only when you introduce the possibility of not getting what you want, and in fact having the opposite of what you want happen, only then does the game achieve meaning. And so I think a lot of folks end up never really getting to experience the best of what role-playing games can offer, because they get themselves trapped in this very shallow, ego-driven cycle. But it's similar to the two different schools of thought on the self-esteem movement, right? Where you have one school of thought in the self-esteem movement just says you should practice unconditional self-affirmation. And then another school of thought, like Nathaniel Branden, the 7 Pillars of Self-Esteem, says that self-esteem is grounded in reality and should be a process of self-betterment. And I guess I would say you can kind of see that distinction in different game designs as well.
Yeah, it's almost like the two philosophies, the competing things going on right now, that games should be validating and accessible, or games should be challenging and reward skill, because otherwise, like you said, if victory is guaranteed, what does it mean?
Right.
And
why not just read a book?
Yeah, and it's I guess, I guess there's an argument to be made for, well, everybody should. It's funny because it's one of these many completely hypocritical polar shifts within a camp, right? The same camp who believes in validation through games believes that everything should be sanitized and evil acts should not be allowed, right? And maybe that's the same in that they want nothing challenging their worldview.
Right. To me, it's an enfeeblement. It's an enfeeblement of the mind and soul. Yeah.
You actually think, is it an enfeeblement or is it never developed?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, right? It's been left undeveloped. Yes.
Yeah. Like they were never developed. They were never allowed to develop skills through, you build a muscle, it's resistance. You build character through resistance as well, right?
Exactly.
I try to be charitable to people who have different views about these things than I do, but I find myself getting more and more bored by just choice-driven narrative games, as opposed to something with, like, something like Until Dawn, or what's the new one, The Quarry. When characters can die, or something like Heavy Rain, where some of the choices have consequence and you have to deal with the character dying. You get to the end, but they're very different endings. That twigs with that thing you're saying of, if there is no challenge, then there's really no reward, no reason to improve. I'm wondering, however, as I say that, if that's a feature, not a bug, of the validation school of philosophy.
I think for them it is a feature, and different strokes for different folks. Like, I don't begrudge anyone who seeks that out as their experience. They're welcome to it. It's just not the experience I want, and I'm grateful that some games exist that cater to folks that have more my interest, and that's the sort of game I design. I think where I get annoyed and have to exercise self-restraint to not get into Twitter fights is when people take a stance of condemnation against artists or game designers who choose to offer up a game that's challenging and specifically wish to do it that way. And they take that as some personal affront. And I just think not everything has to be for everybody. Not everything is for me. Not everything is for you. Doesn't have to be. That's okay. There should be something for everybody, but not everything has to be for everybody.
Yeah, I don't know how you make a product that's for everyone. You have to make certain binary choices. Like you said, whether it's a fluffy free-for-all or whether it's crunchy rules-driven, that immediately eliminates.
Yep. Exactly.
And it's a binary choice, right?
Exactly.
Right?
And so what happens is you get this moral judgment that our way is the true right way. And if you like this other thing, then you are obviously a bad person.
But isn't that... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we just see that all the time. That's, I don't like this thing, you're a bad person, is like 90% of Twitter conversation.
Or arguments of definition.
Yeah.
And I just got excited there because now I can do the, well, Mr. Frodo, I'm back, going right back to the beginning of this, and this idea of moral judgments, snap moral judgments. And this is what people are doing when, well, orcs are Mongols and therefore it's racist, and gamifying evil. Back to this idea of, if you do not allow evil races in a role-playing game, how do you examine good and evil? Where's the win there? Whereas,
Right.
as you said, most people don't want to go and kill conscripted soldiers that you see as, the guy who wasn't supposed to be there today. You want to kill zombies,
exactly.
you want to kill monsters, you want to kill demons, right?
Exactly.
How do you get the other that's, viable and fungible, to get into, terminologies related to objectification, objects that you can smash up and not feel bad? How do you get that if you're not allowed to create bad guys?
And I think the answer is that there is a certain school of thought that says that you ought not want that. And in fact, we should aspire to eliminate the concept of the other in order to create acceptance of all things always. And that games are a retrograde influence to the extent that they promote us smashing the other, objectifying the other, fighting the other, using violence. You see that all the time on lots of gaming websites and highfalutin articles, and so that's the natural outcome of that philosophy. Is that the ideal RPG would be the one where you don't fight the orcs, you actually make peace with them, and then everybody lives in a prosperous anarcho commune.
But that's a value judgment as well, that an anarcho commune is the ideal society, right?
Yes, I would assert so, but I'm certain there's other people who would claim that it's.
I know you're doing devil's advocate right here, but it just seems like the attempt to eliminate the other is just creating a massive other.
I agree.
All these things are verboten, right? You can't depict it and have it be evil. It must be cleansed from the entire world, which, that's like, to me, that is more othering than depicting a race as evil. Now, I say this as somebody who played an orc playable character in a campaign once, who was basically kicked out of orc society for being gay. That was fun because he had a very well-groomed beard and really liked fruit, and
That's
he always had an apple, and he had to stand in a box because he wasn't quite tall enough. But when you have an evil race, you can do what everybody eventually does when you play role-playing games for a really long time. I'm gonna make an iconoclast. I'm gonna make my own Dritz.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Sure. That's part of the fun. To me, and I know I'm getting on a bit of a soapbox here, like my orc character, but when you say you're not allowed to have this, you deny that possibility for experiences that challenge our own thoughts of good and evil.
Absolutely, you do. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, one of the few lawful evil characters I ever played actually made me really question morality, because some of the things he did, what was so disturbing and yet so compelling about playing lawful evil characters, is they do things for reasons, right? It's not, I'm just going to rip and tear until it is done. It's not a mindless savage that just wants to destroy. There's the order, right? And this is, I think, where Oron was going with, because I know some of the games he runs, but order to a lawful evil character is a greater virtue than goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So why isn't it good?
Well, to that, and that's where we go back to the fact that the alignments are named from the point of view of lawful good. They're not named from the point of view of lawful evil or chaotic evil or whatever.
Well, I had to do okay, why is this guy lawful evil? Well, because he thinks it's good because he benefits. There's an element of selfishness in, yes, my lawful good character was a guy. He was still a ginger, but he was a guy. But, it's like, if I do better, the world is better. Therefore, I can do shortcuts. I can manipulate people. Because ultimately I'm smarter than everyone else, so the world is better because I'm in charge. But then I had to go, no, that's lawful neutral.
Right.
It's consequentialist. There has to be he doesn't actually believe it. That no, he's created a permission structure for himself. He's doing it because might is right.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. Evil is might is right.
Right. And that exploration of that, to me, I think made me understand moral philosophy more than God, Immanuel Kant ever did.
Absolutely. I mean, look, here's an interesting thought for you. So imagine you're playing a role-playing game where just you are the descendant of the goddess of death, and as a result, you need to offer a blood sacrifice to her every month. And if you don't do that, you start to weaken. And when you die, you will go to an afterlife that she controls, which will either be paradise or hell, depending on whether you obeyed the goddess of death. And there's nothing you can do about it. She objectively exists. There's no doubt about it. You literally have magic powers. She talks to you. What do you do in that circumstance? And that is the world that Dungeons and Dragons confronts us with. It's a world of objective good and evil, objective realities to these things. And a lot of people just they cannot wrap their head around that. And because we're so in today's society, we're so ingrained in relativistic thinking that there can't really be objective. Who's to say it's good and evil? Well, literally your God just said so, and your soul is going to be damned for all eternity if you disagree. Okay, what do you do? And we know historically how people behaved in those circumstances is they did what they thought the gods told them to do. They were pretty darn okay, whether that was sacrificing their babies like in Carthage, or ripping out the still beating hearts of people on pyramids like they did in the Aztecs, or killing them all and letting God sort them out like they did in the Crusades. Like pretty much, people will do what they believe the gods tell them to do. And so I think if anything, like in role-playing games, we honestly we're like every player in a role-playing game is almost like a really chill centrist compared to how extreme real human historical behavior has been when people thought they had objective evidence of what God wanted them to do.
Yeah, they've found over and over again that people behave more altruistically in things like World of Warcraft than they do in the real world. If there's a plague or something like that, which is interesting because that's completely counter to what the theory of the case for not allowing the ability to be evil in games would dictate, right? People choose to be good more often there than they do in the real world.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. All right, so we've been going for an hour. I will let you go, or we will be here for another 2. Is there anything else you want people to know? I've been spamming the chat with your crowdfund
I saw the
whole
links.
time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm sure people are going to check it out after that because they don't want to miss the interview.
Let me just address one person who brought up something, which is Mayor of Albk said, a thing that bothers me about fantasy races is they have this real world equivalent, like the elves are French, the orcs are vaguely Native American. So I just wanted to tell you that bothers me too. And so the dwarves in this book are not designed to be fat Scottish men with beards or fat Vikings with beards. They're their own race. They're their own species. So I'm with you on that. It's annoying, and I don't think it's good game design. I don't think it's good world building.
That's like my pet peeve of no matter what country a historical film takes place in, they have British accents.
Yes, no matter what, it's always British.
Why do they have British accents? So the Count of Monte Cristo.
Yep, it's kind of hilarious.
This means old, right? Yes. It's just so...
Even though the British accent that they adopt is actually only 100 years old.
Yeah. It's funny how we mythologize. I mean, that's the whole medievalist tradition that Dungeons and Dragons comes from, right? It's a romanticized view of a World War II filter on a romanticized view of medieval times.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Because I was like, no, if I start at romantic, that's actually wrong. Because it was Tolkien's first World War experience, which is nice up and down, but come on, right? That filtered that. And then it was Gygax's military strategy games that brought in that element to it. So it's like all the periods of major global conflict mushed into a really comforting ball with pretty clothes and shiny hair.
Yes, exactly.
Which is the exact opposite of what real war is like.
Well, yeah. Thank God I haven't been to real war. I've been a lot of the fantasy wars with the pretty clothing though.
All right, Alex Macris, thanks so much.
Thanks so
guys,
much for having me on.
You can check out it's Autark. Is that how it's
Autark.
pronounced?
Yeah, Autark.
Games for all the different. It's not Autark. It's just Autark. It's not Autark Games. I realized that when I was doing it, but here's the website for that. Here, if you want to check out the other products that got by, if you missed the Ascendant interview before, you can go back and watch that. But then there's the crowdfund, which has 8 days to go now. So you're right in the home stretch. I mean, you're fully funded by a
we're
lot.
In the home stretch. So. Now it's just, how much extra do we make? So
right. And is there going to be is there anything else coming down the pipe that you can tease right now? You seem to pull these out.
I got another book coming for Ascendant Rogues Gallery coming out later this year. So we're going to be doing another
already. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, should be fantastic. Good. So hopefully it does well too.
All right. Thanks so much for taking the time. You guys can catch more of Alex on It's Not Therapy this week. We talk about life skills learned from tabletop role-playing games. We focused on the philosophy because you guys can handle it. Regular audience like, too much. So you guys know the drill. I'm going to switch over. We're going to come back with some Yakuza Kiwami. Ironically, the big finale of Yakuza Kiwami in about 10 minutes. So Alex, thanks so much.
Bye-bye all. Thanks for having me.